thank you so much, everyone, for being here this evening, for coming from everywhere from, Vancouver to the UK is joining this call. Uh, we wanted to host a discussion about death, partially because Halloween's coming up, so seasonally it felt quite appropriate. But it's also something that I think is on the minds of a lot of humanists, atheists, and people around the world, especially as we get older. I'm not going to judge how old anyone on this call is, but we all have loved ones who die. It's an inevitable part of life is death. And yet, I'm going to assume most of the people who wanted to come to this call, how do we approach that in a non-religious and humanist framework is a growing question. And there are more and more, non-religious people out there. I think it's a more and more pertinent question. So I'm excited for that conversation tonight. For those who haven't met me, I'm Ian Bushfield, Executive Director of the BC Humanist Association. A couple years ago, I co-authored the End of Life Guide that the BCHA put out with Sophie Burke, who's now in Montreal. And I'm really proud to be joined here by one of our board members, Janice Selbie, who's the president of CASHA in Kelowna, and Megan Sheldon, who's the founder of Be Ceremonial. And I'll have them both introduce themselves in one more second. I do want to acknowledge I'm coming from the traditional and ancestral territories of the Coquitlam peoples, and that everything we do at the BCHA is trying to further a more progressive and inclusive world. And we can only do that with your support. We've had an incredible amount of generosity helping build the association in the last few months. Things are looking incredible for our momentum, and I'm excited to keep that up. So look forward to lots more fundraising emails from me in the coming months, but I also appreciate that not everyone can always chip in, but just seeing your faces here is great tonight. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Janice to introduce herself first, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Ian. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm joining you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. I'm in Kelowna, British Columbia. And Ian mentioned that I serve right now as the president of CASHA. That stands for Kelowna Atheists, Skeptics, and Humanists Association. And that is how I actually met Ian. And I'm so fortunate now to serve alongside him on the board of BCHA. And for my work, I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. So my area of special interest is religious trauma because I come from a deeply fundamentalist religious background, which I am no longer religious, but I am a secular humanist. So as a therapist and as a coach, I work with people recovering from religious trauma, and often that involves trauma around death and fear of hell. So that's in my wheelhouse. That's a lot of the work that I do. I also have a podcast called Divorcing Religion, the YouTube channel called Divorcing Religion, and I'm the founder of the Conference on Religious Trauma and the Shameless Sexuality Life After Purity Culture Conference. And I'm just starting another podcast called Sex and Power, the Sex and Power podcast. So reach out to Ian and he can give you any contact information for me that you want. And I'm so pleased and proud to share the stage tonight with Megan.
Great. And I should say after this conversation, I'll hope to get the recording up on YouTube fairly quick. And we'll also send an email with lots of links from both Janice and Selbie and myself for you to follow up on resources. Megan, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and your interest in death?
Haha, thanks everybody. Nice to meet you all and be here. And yeah, nice to meet you, Janice, in person, virtually. It's really phenomenal, the work that you're doing. I come at this work as somebody who is deeply curious about ritual and ceremony. And for the most part of my life, I wasn't sure how to access it. I was raised secular without strong connections to my cultural ancestry. So when loss happened, I lost 5 friends in my 20s. I had recurrent miscarriages, and we lost a parent to ALS. And I think I kind of looked around and kept waiting for somebody to create this ceremony or guide me through rituals, and nothing happened. And that silence was quite deafening and isolating. So I rolled up my sleeves and started to learn and research and explore and experiment with rituals and ceremonies outside of cultural appropriation. So being very mindful of not taking what's not mine and yet looking at the universality of ritual. I have a master's in cultural mythology, so I come by this with a curiosity for story, for myth, for archetype. And through that, my husband and I have built an app called Be Ceremonial, which is a guided ritual platform that lets people choose their own ritual adventure. You can create ceremonies across the life cycle from IVF and infertility to divorce to the changing of the seasons, right through to planning a living funeral or a death anniversary. And I think I just want to remind everybody that no matter what, we are naturally ceremonial. We have ritual in our bones. And I'm also an end-of-life doula, so I support a lot of people in the conversations around death and dying on how to bring ritual into the grief journey.
That's great. Thank you. I'll just put it out there that if anyone has questions at any time, feel free to raise your hand if you're comfortable being on the recording, or put your question in the comments and I can help bring it into the conversation. Janice, I'll go back to you. You mentioned your work with religious trauma and that people have this baggage related to hell and to, maybe a dark or threats in the afterlife. Maybe expand upon that and how you help navigate people through who maybe don't believe in that anymore, but are still struggling with that.
Yeah, great question. So for some people, we can have that, it can be fairly quick, the when we break the belief, moving from I once believed in supernatural, but now actually I'm much more evidence-based. So the logic part of that can happen quickly for some people, but the nervous system part of it can take a lot longer. That fear can still reside and be activated even years down the road, even for people who are atheist and subscribe to naturalism. They don't believe anything about supernatural or afterlife or anything, but they can still be triggered and have fears related to hell. And actually, when we were talking about having this discussion tonight, I was thinking of my friend and colleague, Dr. Terry Daniel. And Terry wrote a book called Grief and God, When Religion Does More Harm Than Healing. And she talked about how toxic theology can complicate grief. And I think that's really an important element of what we're looking at today. So the idea being loss and fear can go together. So if someone is trying to recover from a loss, or they're mourning a loss, then maybe they're also plagued with fear around what if their loved one went to hell, or maybe the survivor is suffering with loss and then guilt because they're now doubting God after the tragedy. So then the guilt compounds the loss. And for ex-believers, it can be a double loss. They mourn the person who's gone, and they're also mourning the comforting beliefs that they had. And that was, I feel like I've experienced all of those things in my life as I have moved farther and farther away after divorcing religion. And so I did have one thought that's maybe a little more positive on that, but just the idea that spaces like this that Ian is providing, secular grief spaces and humanist rituals, remind us that love and memory and meaning don't depend on theology. And that's something that I think is really important for the people I work with, to recognize. They're allowed to mourn and grieve losses in their own way.
And you do a lot of that work directly, Megan, right? In crafting ceremonies, but I imagine some of the pushback you might get, especially from some of the maybe people on the call, or maybe just like the atheists we know, quiver, or like they don't feel comfortable with the idea of ritual. So how do you know, argue that ritual is important for the non-religious and help people feel comfortable with things they worry are too religious?
Yeah, good question. It is definitely something that comes up a lot, this awkwardness about ritual. I've been doing this work. I'm a humanist celebrant, and, creating ceremonies for people for the better part of 10 years. And I would say 10 years ago was a bit of a different story. I think COVID really shifted our thinking about how to reimagine ritual and ceremony in our lives. So in some ways, it did us a favor because it took away the normal things that we would depend on, and it forced us to get creative and look at what actually matters, and instead of just taking the script of the funeral or of the wedding and saying, okay, we're going to follow this just because it's been handed to us, people started to question it. So most people come to me saying something along the lines of, I'm going through this major change in my life, whether it's an organ transplantation or a divorce, or they've been given a terminal diagnosis. So we're going through this major phase and I want to do something, but I don't know where to start. So there's usually that desire to mark this time of change, this rite of passage, this thing that's happening, but they don't know what to do with that. And words like ritual and ceremony, in my ceremony training, we spent a whole session on unpacking our baggage with the definitions, because most definitions include words like religious, rigid, repeated. And so my first class is all about, let's redefine what ritual and ceremony means to us personally. And I offer my working definitions, not for people to have to adopt as their own, but for us to question, what is a ritual in my life, and what is a ceremony, and how are they different? And can I, I've had people reach out who had an abortion, a woman who had an abortion 30 years ago, and I helped her create a ceremony to acknowledge that loss retroactively. And it was incredibly powerful to see the transformation that happened when she was finally able to recognize this thing that had happened within her, around her, finally give it that acknowledgement space that it's so desperately needed. I've also had people come for do-over ceremonies. So, they had their husband's funeral and they probably went along with what everybody told them to do. And a year later or 5 years later, they're still left feeling like they didn't quite do it right. And most people kind of stop there and they think, well, I've done it. I don't get a chance to do it over. And my philosophy is, let's throw all of that out the window and we can do whatever we want. There are no rules, which is fun and a little bit defiant, and trying to break some of those rules that we think we have to adhere to. But creating do-over ceremonies, do-over funerals, creating multiple funerals. I'll sometimes work with a family and the four siblings are squabbling about what they want to do for mom. So I'll sometimes work with each of them individually and create their own version of a ritual or a ceremony so that they're getting what they need personally before they come together as a community. So I think for me, it's just it's coloring outside the lines, and I think that's the permission that secularism and humanism gives us, is that we get to kind of reimagine what it looks like for us.
Yeah, I've had this trouble when, as the Humanist Association, we've asked the BC government for the right to perform marriages a few times, and they've denied us. And they ask us, well, what is a humanist marriage? And we go, it's whatever people want. And they don't like that answer, right? Because they're used to the square box of a religion. Like a United Church marriage looks like this, a Buddhist marriage looks like this, a Hindu marriage looks like this. Well, what is a humanist marriage? Well, it's a personal ceremony that's crafted to reflect the specific values of the individuals who turn up and are there, and their friends and family, and build that community. And so there's things we can use regularly and draw from. And you have some great resources. I imagine you have stuff you would pull from Janice and many other people. We could all think of, our favorite poetry, or probably our favorite Carl Sagan quote for many of you, but none of that is required, right? There's no dogma. Um, Janice, do you find people struggle with that freedom when they leave religion?
Yeah, I think that can really be an issue for people, because there can be so much fear around doing something wrong. So perfectionism, and also the um, fundamentalism of the Christianity that I was part of is also very heavily surveillance oriented. God is always watching you, waiting to smite you. So then when people, they might be able to extricate themselves from fundamentalism, but sometimes it's harder to pull out the fundamentalist thinking from our brain. And that can also include perfectionism and fear of doing things wrong, especially when you're thinking of something as big as marking the loss of a person. And Megan, I wanted to say, I love that you worked with someone to create ceremony and ritual around abortion, because that can be the disenfranchised grief that's not socially sanctioned. That can be some of the most powerful, those things when we give ourselves permission to do ceremony and ritual to actually acknowledge and honor those losses, because they can be so significant. So I'm really delighted to know that you are doing that sort of work with people. It's a big deal, and one one person that I do lean on heavily is Dr. Irvin Yalom, and he's a psychiatrist, and his specialty was about death and terror of death. And his book is Staring at the Sun: Overcoming the Terror of Death. And he made this comment that I think was so profound. He said, "Though the physicality of death destroys us, the idea of death saves us." So this idea that when we face our mortality, we stop sleepwalking through life. We actually wake up, and how the recognizing the brevity of life is what can increase the intensity of life for us. So to stop being scared of it, but to befriend it, because when we do befriend the idea of death, it can actually make us come alive to the idea of life.
That was really great. Thank you for that, Janice. I mean, it's interesting, right? We planned this in part, and we discussed planning this in part because there's so little discussion about death in Canada and in the West these days. I think some sociologists argue as people become more secular, they are detached from religion, where there are these established rituals that mean, you have a community where you're used to talking about death and addressing it in a certain way. But because we've freed ourselves so much from that, well, we've also kind of lost that tight-knit community. It's not as individualized. And it was interesting, you mentioned COVID earlier, Megan, and that was something that put death in our face, right? Every day, the news was how many people died, how many people are in long-term care homes suffering. And some of that was statistics that maybe you were lucky and didn't know anyone directly, or maybe it was very personal and a loved one had to die or be in pain. Well, you couldn't even see them in person, and maybe you could only do a video call. I don't know where I'm going with this on a question, but I'm just kind of processing the thoughts as we go. I don't know what you want to pick up on there, Megan, and I'll form a better question in a minute.
No, it's okay. Well, just jumping back a little bit to what Janice was mentioning about, the retroactive rituals. The thing that I think I'm most curious about and where my work really leans in right now is what I call the seemingly invisible moments. So we kind of have ceremonies around birth and marriage and death, kind of around graduation, maybe around retirement. They're not always great. Some of them I find a bit too cookie cutter, but they're there at least, right? We have a funeral, we have a celebration of life, and a big part of my work is reimagining those. But where I'm really curious is in the less visible moments. I worked with a group of about 100 women in the States with an author called Hope Edelman, who wrote a book called Motherless Daughters. And these women all lost their moms when they were quite young. They were, 2 years old or 10 years old. Some of them weren't invited to their mom's funeral. And now this group of women, within the next calendar year, were going to turn their age that their mother was when their mother died. And it was this silent threshold that they had been building up their entire life, and yet it was completely invisible to no one, to everyone else. For the most part, the people that had crossed that silent threshold hadn't told anybody about it. It's something like, what do you do? Call up your friends and say, well, I'm about to turn 53 and my mom was 53 when she died. It's a really hard week. Can you do something for me? Like it's not in our way of life to talk about that, to be vulnerable. And then the people you would tell, they'd probably be like, I don't know what to do for you. Do you want to go out for dinner? Do you want to not talk about it? Should we go somewhere where we can push it aside. And so I worked with these 100 women to each create their own personal ceremony. Some of it was on their own, some of it was with family or friends. Some of them came together within the community to co-host and create something together. But they all acknowledged that point of turning that death age. And when we think about, I do a lot of work with medical assistants in dying and living funerals and death anniversaries. There's so many moments that kind of surround death that we don't talk at all about. Like, we don't talk about death much, but at least we talk about it a little. But then we think about grief and loss and all of the different types of grief and pet loss and, all these complicated things that get thrown in there. And that's when you realize just how grief phobic we are as a society. So I think my hope today is for people to start to recognize that a conversation about death is not always just a conversation about death. There's, when somebody dies, it often brings up our unresolved grief from other deaths that happened in our life, and they've compounded because we haven't acknowledged them. So if anything, my hope is that we all see ritual and ceremony, however you define it, whatever you're going to call it or do it, it's an acknowledgement. It's something that you bring attention to, intention and attention to something that you're holding, something that you're feeling, and just give that a little bit of space to breathe, because otherwise that balloon gets bigger and bigger, as I'm sure Janice has seen, and one day it just bursts because we hit burnout, we hit compassion fatigue, we can't process all of these griefs at once, and so they kind of come at us in a traumatic way. So yeah, my hope is just to start to look for the little moments in day-to-day life when we can acknowledge the day-to-day griefs that we might be feeling.
Yeah, you talk about those kind of anniversaries or, hidden moments, and my child has a heart defect and who's very young, she's only 6, but she's had 3 open heart surgeries. And one of the things we do is, she's very healthy now, but is have like a heart anniversary. So it's been a year since she had her heart surgery. And there's even someone connected through the charity that's connected to this, who will put together a gift box for the kid. And it's some chocolates and some balloons and all heart-shaped stuff. But it's just a way of acknowledging that, was a major traumatic life event to go through, and mark that. And I think that those can be so important and are, like you say, just easily missed, right? But then it kind of compound, and that, I think, is why, as much as I'm not a, touchy-feely type person historically, but I think we recognize the importance of the sentimentality, the acknowledgement, as you put it. Maybe you can build on this, Janice, from your work. Ceremony is important, I assume, in your view, or at least these acknowledgements, right?
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, I'm going to show you this. So I had the honor of interviewing Sasha Sagan a few years ago on a podcast, and this is her book. For small creatures such as we, rituals for finding meaning in our unlikely world. Yay! I guess it's such a great book, and she was just such an interesting person for me to interview, because we didn't watch Cosmos in my house when we were growing up. We didn't watch anything that might talk about science or evolution or anything like that. Not even the nature of things. So to as an adult, then to have to educate myself about science and those sorts of things has been really interesting. And then to connect with someone whose dad was such an important part of science in North America. But yeah, so really thinking about ritual and giving ourselves permission, because it seemed like when I left the church, I couldn't celebrate Christmas anymore. Easter was terribly painful for me for many years, as was Christmas after I left church. I would just cry and cry. I couldn't listen to Christmas carols on the radio. And Easter, the day itself, was very hard for me, because in my church there was tremendous celebration around Easter, because they believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. And suddenly I wasn't part of that club anymore, and I couldn't participate in those rituals, and I didn't have anything else to take its place. And so that just compounded things and made it so much harder. And that's one reason I was so grateful to find out about Kasha and to connect with humanists who they're not bound by this idea of having a religious ritual. They can celebrate solstice and just celebrate anything that we want to celebrate. We're allowed to do it. And that is so liberating. And also, I'll say that's where support groups can come in handy for people to be able to connect and talk with others who have suffered profound loss, whatever the loss is. So for me and my group, it's the loss of identity, community, and worldview when they leave their religion behind. And those are pretty major losses. So to be able to talk with others who understand is very powerful.
Yeah, I saw Hemant Mehta talk in one of his, I think it was at Weekend Reason in Calgary, and one of his big reasons for hope, this is the Friendly Atheist, is the rise of ex-religious communities on Reddit, connected through groups like yours, Janice, where even if, the energy of the new atheist movement has waned, and you can have any thoughts you want about that, but he says there's still hope for the secular future because there are people who've left controlling religions and they're finding each other and they're building something positive out of that. Um, so I hear what you're saying, Janice, and there's always space for groups like ours, I have to say. Um, but I want to turn.
Totally. And
Go ahead.
mhm. I was going to say, Um, I do have a couple of questions that I go over with my clients. So I let me know if this is jumping ahead. But so if they've come to a realization or they no longer have a belief in an afterlife, and also they've lost their sense of meaning and purpose, because religion is really big on giving us a meaning and purpose. So my questions for my clients then are, if I no longer believe in an afterlife, what gives my life meaning now? That's one of the biggest questions. And then the other one is, if I won't see my loved ones again, how can I honor their memory now? And that's the type of thing where Megan's work has made the book is so important.
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of pivot to the more like almost practical side of like how do we start to think about planning our death, planning these ceremonies beyond just downloading the app. Um, like you said, Megan, you've done a lot of this work directly with people. Like I come to you, my parents are dying, they're non-religious. We want to craft something. Where do you begin?
Well, as my dear friend Krista always says, the worst time to plan a funeral is when you have to plan a funeral. And so my hope right now is to talk about death and dying and grief and ritual and ceremony whenever I can. I have two small children. I remember a few years ago, one of them was in kindergarten, and one of the moms asked me what I do for a living. And there's always this kind of moment where it's like, how deep do I go in this kindergarten drop-off line? And I just told her I'm an end of life doula and a funeral celebrant. And she kind of paused and she went, "Oh, wow, that's so fascinating. My mom was just diagnosed with a terminal illness. I've been like, she opened up in this way that we never would have had in that moment had I not had a little bit of bravery and a little bit of courage to kind of open up that door." So that's my belief right now, is that we all just need to have a little bit more courage to have a hard conversation, to start a hard conversation. And storytelling is the magical wand that like makes all of this possible. If I can share a story with you about what I did to honor a miscarriage that I had, or when my father-in-law died, how we did a do-over ceremony because his funeral ended up being quite religious and he was not religious. So 3 months later, my husband and I created a backyard barbecue and did a do-over in a way that we think he would have appreciated, in a way that served us. When I tell people those stories, you can see this little light bulb moment for them when they think, "Oh, wow, okay." But my real hope is that we start thinking about this before we need to. I'm currently running a 4-week end of life planning course. On Saturday, it's our final session, and we have 20 people from all over the world. And every week we talk about like the head and the heart. So the practical stuff, what actually happens when you die physically. It's a funeral director that I'm co-hosting it with. So it's quite fascinating. People have a lot of kind of head questions about like, how do I know when, if my father's dying and these signs are happening, what should I look for? How should I help? But then the other part is the heart piece, which often gets mistaken. When we think about end of life planning, I imagine most of you think about getting your will in order, getting your medical directives, legally, financially. That's usually where we stop. And yet, usually when people come and find me to plan a ceremony at the end of their life or for a loved one who's just died, we're not talking about finances, we're not talking about legality, we're talking about memories, we're talking about, what was their favorite scent, what did they love to smell, what did they love to taste, what place did they go to that made them feel alive. So the more that we can really lean into our living legacy now, before we die, and record it. Like I've got this journal, I've got this box I'm 44 years old and I have a whole box full of ideas about when I die. I imagine my kids opening that box up, having some letters that I've written to them, hearing about some of my favorite places that I visited. If I was planning on being cremated, but now I think I want a green burial. So I've kind of crossed out that original plan and said, if possible, I would love a green burial on Salt Spring Island. This is what it could feel like. If it's not possible, you can cremate me, that's fine too. Maybe spread my ashes up by Hornby Island. Again, it's not prescriptive, but I'm giving my children something. I'm giving my husband something to hold on to because we don't know when death happens, right? It's hopefully I have a good long life in front of me, but I feel so much less afraid about death because I've done so much of this heart work now. And it's not over. It's not, that's the part of the course is we say like, once you got your box, don't just put it away and forget about it. Like it's a living, breathing thing to be in relationship with our mortality.
Yeah, the importance of those conversations and thinking about it, it's a core part of our end of life guide, among many others. Um, but I think one of the challenges that probably comes up, and I'll turn this question to you, Janice, is what about when your relatives don't agree? I'm non-religious, but all the rest of my family's still evangelical. And how do you navigate those kind of challenges, as you can imagine, come up quite regularly?
Yeah, and the other one I was thinking of was what happens because this does happen fairly frequently in my community. Um, if religion has created such a wedge that someone has made a firm boundary and they have gone no contact with a loved one, with a family member, and that was the case. That's the situation I was in when my dad died and we went no contact when he was 80 and then he died at 84 and my so one of my siblings also was no contact with our dad and we had one other sibling who still was and we had been trying to get hold of our mom for a few days. She lived separately from dad. They were divorced, but they were still in contact. And finally, when it was the third day, I was having trouble reaching her. And my other brother said, you know what, I bet maybe dad is dying and mom is sitting vigil with him. And so I phoned the care home where he was living, and that's exactly what was going on. And I was shocked that our other brother didn't tell me that, but he didn't know that he could tell me that, and he felt uncomfortable. He didn't want to bring up difficult things for me, but it turned out that part of my healing was finding out that my dad was near the end and being able to go in and sit with him. And he couldn't talk anymore, so I felt very safe. But I could hold his hand and just sit there quietly with him and just to tell him, "I'm here, Dad," and that was meaningful for me. But so people can't read our minds, and this is also where uh, doing some advanced planning is quite necessary and very helpful. And I think our loved ones will thank us for it if we are able to write out what we want in a service, what kind of service we want, what kind of songs, do we want music or anything like this, or even to say, I don't want any talk of religion at my service, none at all. Now, if it's a religious person who has died, then the challenge for my community is deciding how strong do they feel emotionally? Do they want to set foot back in a church? Maybe there was abuse that took place there. There can be lots of water under the bridge. Do they feel strong enough to go? Would they like to ask someone else to accompany them? Can they sit near the back? Can they just send a card and some flowers or a letter or something like that? Because really, I want people to protect their own mental health. Nobody else can do it for you. You have to take care of your own mental health. Sometimes that means you might not feel comfortable participating in going to a funeral, but sometimes it can be very healing to do so. So you really have to know yourself and how strong you are at any given time. But I don't think you have to feel obligated to attend a funeral service. You can say goodbye to someone in your own way, and that's the type of work that Megan does with folks.
Yeah, and that just stresses my point around like multiple ceremonies. We put so much pressure on one big funeral or celebration of life. I've talked so many people out of planning a celebration of life because I've told them, I, from what I've heard, from what you've told me, I don't think that's the best thing for you now. Like, I think you should do a smaller healing ceremony. And I work with parents who lost, a child to the opioid crisis, to drug overdose, and they feel pressured by their community to have a celebration of life, but they are nowhere near ready to have that type of tone that often, like celebrations of life for most people, they have this idea that it shouldn't be too sad, right? That there's like, oh, well, we don't want it to be too sad. We want it to be joyful and celebratory. But that's not the case for a lot of people. And so, what can we do? What are the smaller steps? How can we kind of divide the community and have smaller ceremonies that are supportive for the different groups of friends, the different, maybe there could be a religious ceremony, but there could also be a ceremony in a different place, a different time that offers a different purpose. So, I think the less pressure we put off things being perfect, things being performative, doing it just because we're supposed to, like that's not a good enough reason. I think if it's clear to me that the intention for a ceremony is we're doing this because we're supposed to. Okay, great. That's the intention. It's obligatory. It's for somebody else. Now we're going to make our decisions through a different lens because it's no longer about your own personal healing. And I'll often work with that person in a separate way so that they have had their own type of, um, you know, processing before that other event takes place. So, yeah, I think it just thinking outside the box again, that it doesn't have to be just one square kind of version of what a funeral looks like or what a celebration of life should be.
Yeah, that's one of
And
the things.
and they can
It's
be
go ahead.
healing.
Yeah.
Doing it different ways can be healing. I remember being in New Orleans a few years ago, and I was there with my mom. She was in her early 80s, and we were sitting outside having coffee at some cafe, and sure enough, come walking down the street, it was a funeral procession complete with instruments, with a tuba and a trombone, and very somber, and it was so interesting to be able to witness that. And guess what? People were crying. Like people were crying. They were sad. But this was a community doing what that community did for one another to mark a passing. And so, even though that might not feel like what I want for me here in Kelowna, it surely suited those folks there. It was just very interesting.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of the work myself in crafting a will and, representation agreements. And part of that is like, well, what do you do with your body? And you mentioned, Megan, the like debate between cremation versus green burial. And there's a few options. BC is weird because you're not allowed a aquamation or a liquid, um, which is actually a pretty environmental way to dispose of a body, because our funeral or our what is it, our Human Remains Act is quite antiquated. But this is one of those things where different jurisdictions have different ways that you can deal with the body. And so in my own thinking as a humanist or as an atheist, I go, well, I'm not going to be there, right? My belief is I end at death. And so most of these ceremonies are for the people who loved me or who cared about me. And it feels wrong for me to plan that for them. I have, I can describe what my life is like and the kind of person I am, and hopefully that influences how the ceremony goes. But honestly, whatever makes them feel, process their grief and work through that, I think is one of the key things that I'm hopeful for. Well, also not just like leaving the people who survive me with nothing, right? Because I think that's also a risk. The other thing that I think is really interesting in the changing landscape in Canada these days is since the legalization you mentioned earlier of medical assistance in dying, we have people who can have, and there were before, like living funerals, right? Or living memorials. Have you dealt with those, Megan, or come across where people know their death is imminent, but want to celebrate or recognize or acknowledge that just before?
Yeah, they're some of my favorite ceremonies to be involved with because there's so much intentionality. The people that I work with who are planning, it's either the person who will die, within the foreseeable future. They've applied for me, they've been approved. They now want to gather their loved ones and be at their funeral and to, appreciate everyone coming together, or it's the spouse or child of a parent who would like to have this opportunity to showcase their love, the impact, the legacy that their parent or spouse had on them. And it's complicated for a lot of people because not everybody will necessarily agree with the decision. Not everybody's most people aren't comfortable with, people are bad at funerals to say the least, but living funerals is a whole different ball game. And yet when approached with care, and part of my planning and in my end of life planning course, one of the questions I ask that comes from a beautiful book called The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. And one of the most important aspects of a gathering, she says, is not only who should be there, but who should not be there. And so a big question that we spend time with is who is not going to adhere to the intentionality that you're setting forth? Who is going to take this in a different direction? And how can we ensure that that energy, that person, that perspective is not here? Because at the end of the day, this living funeral has a very clear purpose. And we'll have small little rituals built up and beforehand. So in the week leading up to the living funeral, I'll ask people to do things to kind of process their own loss, their own grief, their anticipatory grief. And then as we come together, sometimes I'm present, curating it, but often I'm supporting people to do this themselves, because that's a big part of my philosophy, is that you don't need to have somebody doing this. Like, you naturally can do this. You just need to know where to start. But every time that it's happened, people have come back and said that was one of the most poignant and powerful things I've ever been a part of.
Lynn wanted to ask a question. We will go to a full question period, but if you do want to chime into the discussion, you're welcome to. Just know you will be recorded at this point. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Lynn.
not a problem. So my last living relative, my brother, died a year ago, and I was able to attend to his estate and gave his cremated remains to his friends, who were happy to disperse them the way that they wished to. But in cleaning out his house, I discovered the cremated remains of my parents, which he had done nothing with. And I couldn't quite let myself uh, have them just discarded in the cleaning out of the house. So I took them. And I'm now in this dilemma because they're sitting in my closet. And I don't quite know what to do with them. So I know that they wish to have them dispersed in Alberta. I live in British Columbia. I don't really want to have to travel back to Alberta with these things. Um, and the way that I speak about it is I came from a very, very dysfunctional family and don't have a lot of love or regard for any of them. But there's still this part of my religious upbringing that says you can't just discard them. But my atheist side says, but it doesn't matter. And I'm still struggling with this dilemma. And I'm asking anybody that I can talk to that might give me a perspective on the struggle that I'm going through. What do I do with these things without uh, uh, throwing myself into this moral quagmire?
What a fantastic question, Lynn. You have, I think, the two perfect people to answer that too, between the ex-religious trauma and the ceremony creation. Who wants to touch on it first, maybe?
I'll dive in and then let Janice jump on. Oh, Lynn, it is such a common thing for people to hold on to ashes, cremated remains, and not do anything with them, either because they don't know what to do or because the task that they've been, that's been requested or that they think they need to do is so hard, like bringing them home to the UK or wherever, and they're not going to be doing that for a long time. I know that a lot of funeral homes with internment plots, will offer at times community gatherings. I know that in North Van, our local cemetery, once a year will offer anybody that has cremated remains kind of sitting around in the closet to come together, and they'll create a ceremony and you can add them to a communal internment plot. And it's quite a special way to feel like you're doing something and to do it with others who are you're strangers and yet probably in a similar boat. The Alberta piece, I think, the way that I would approach this or start to invite you to think about is symbolism. Symbolism and metaphor is the language of ritual and ceremony. So if they wanted to be in Alberta, what was it about Alberta that they were searching for? And can you recreate that on different land and territory, right? Was it because they like the wide open plains? Can you go to Kamloops and have a desert feel? Like, does it have to be Alberta soil? If so, can you save a little bit of the cremated remains in a small jar that you will one day take with you, but allow the rest to go? I think Ian's question or comment early on about not, once we die, it doesn't matter to us. Unfortunately, a lot of people take that to the extreme and they say things like, oh, I'll be dead, just donate my body to science. I don't care what you do, and the loved ones left behind are then saddled in the midst of grief with having to figure, and this happens all the time, like, I don't know what song to play. I don't know what flowers they loved. I don't know if they wanted a green burial or to be cremated, and they feel like they're second guessing every situation, every choice, and the anxiety that builds on them is so much pressure that I don't ever want somebody to say, here is my ceremony, follow it directly, read it, top to bottom. It has to be in Alberta at this place, because that might not be possible. But what are the symbols? What's the like metaphoric language that we can give people that might guide them to creating a ceremony of their own that's possible? So, Lynn, my hope, I think, for you would be to try to think about, how can you let some of these go? Because the weight of it, I think, will continue to build in a way that would honor them. And it's about storytelling, it's about symbolism and metaphor. How can you bring parts? Maybe you have a friend in Alberta who can mail you some soil from a part of, some land, some sand. I've had people that have sent pieces of little jars of Nova Scotia sand to the West Coast so that they could bring the East Coast to the West Coast at a ceremony, at a funeral. Sometimes even just a little vial of sand that comes from a different place can make you feel connected to that place. I don't know if that's helpful, but I'll pass it to Janice to see if she wants to expand.
That you have such amazing, fantastic ideas. And I didn't even know about a kind of a community gathering for people who have remains or cremains, however we say it, that are in their possession, that they are ready to release, and they just didn't know what to do. So I love that idea of seeing if there's a funeral home in town that offers that. Speaking to the religion piece or religious trauma piece around it, um, if you've been able to free yourself from any sense of obligation, as far as maybe you were baptized at one point, which is like a promise forever and ever, if you've been able to free yourself from that sense of obligation, then I hope you will be able to free yourself from any sense of obligation around you must treat their remains this way because of religion said so. You're under no obligation at all. And that's hard for some folks to hear, but it is reality. So you're the one that gets to decide. I hope you really think about some of the suggestions that Megan had, but from where I'm sitting, you're free, absolutely free to do as you like with those remains.
So I
Thank you.
think with that, maybe we'll do some closing thoughts from each of you, and then I'll hit stop on the recording and I'll encourage people to just share their own comments or thoughts or questions. Um, for my part, I wanted to keep this like a fairly informal discussion. I'm really glad we were able to cover such incredible ground, and there's so many different ways to approach this. It's not something I think most of us are usually talking about death unless we happen to be sick or know somebody who's quite ill. But or you're Megan and you just work in the field all of the time. But I think tonight has highlighted how important it is and how it doesn't have to be scary. I don't think any of us want to die, and they don't want the people around us to die, but we all know it's going to happen. There are a few people around the world trying to fight it and avoid it with all of their money and science and might, but most of us don't have those privileges. So, and maybe we shouldn't even, but I we'll be reflecting on a lot of this tonight. And, we have this ebook that we put out a few years ago, and we don't talk about it enough even. So I'll be making sure we share that as well with the membership and everyone who is on the call. Um, Maybe I'll go to you, Janice, first. What was your kind of takeaway from tonight, or how do you want to, anything we didn't get to that you wanted to cover?
Sure, yes. So with the idea of secular support on the as we think about death and dying, I recommend that people read books with a naturalistic view of death, connect with death positive communities, and one I can recommend is called The Order of the Good Death, theorderofthegooddeath.com. Prepare with advanced care planning and legacy projects. That does a lot to help us feel more calm about the idea of our own death. Listen to podcasts like the Good Death podcast and Terrible Thanks for Asking. That's one of my favorite podcasts. It really actually is a lot about resilience. There's a good TED Talk called Let's Talk About Dying, and that's by a gentleman named Peter Saul. And I have a game here. You maybe have never thought of a game about death and dying. Megan, you might know it already. It's called Start with Hello, the conversation game about living and dying and what matters most. And you can get that at commonpractice.com. And then the last thought I had was again from Irvin Yalom, kind of along his line of thinking. Don't deny death, befriend it. Impermanence gives life its intensity. Once death stops being the enemy, life stops being a rehearsal. So hopefully that's helpful for someone.
And to you, Megan.
Thank you, Janice. Yeah, I recently was up at Hollyhock Retreat Center on Cortez Island, for those of you who know of it. And I was putting on a workshop for about 100 business leaders called Grief and Loss in the Workplace. And I'm trying to get people to think about grief and death and dying. I'm often called into workplaces after somebody's died. And it's a scramble. We're trying to figure out, how do we acknowledge this? How do we honor them? What do we do? And I really want companies to start thinking about this preemptively ahead of time. So I put on this workshop. We had a range of people in the group. And afterwards, this young man, probably in his mid to late 20s, came up to me and he said, I loved your workshop so much. And I want to believe it in all, but at the core of it, I think I'm just so scared about death. I don't know how to have this conversation. And I process that and I feel that I've been there. And I said to him, what if you're so scared about death is because we're not talking about it, because it's not something that you are accustomed to kind of seeing and being around. You know, we do death incredibly poorly for the most part here in North America. Many people haven't seen a dead body, let alone like gotten into bed and lay with their loved one after they die. We think that when somebody dies, the first thing we have to do is call somebody to fix the, you know, to help us out of this chaotic situation when the worst thing has already happened. Why not, you know, turn on the kettle, settle down. You don't have to call anybody. There is no urgency. My invitation for everybody in Greek kind of terminology, there's two time periods. There's Chronos time and Kairos time. So Chronos time is chronology. So clocks and calendars. And yes, we live, you know, tonight we have to be done by 8:30 p.m. West Pacific time. We live in a world that is dictated by Chronos time. And ritual and ceremony invite us into Kairos time. This is the land of timelessness, where a ritual pause could be 1 minute or 10 minutes. We lose track of time, where a ceremonial gathering isn't following a prescribed order of events, but it's inviting space for storytelling that kind of takes us down a path that we had no idea we would go down. So where is more opportunity in our life that we can carve out for this Kairos time? Because unfortunately, the challenge with secularism is when we left organized religion, or when we kind of left our rituals and ceremonies, we didn't replace it with anything. And so we often kind of focus on the logical side of the brain. We forget to bring in the emotional side of the brain. And Kairos time, I think, is space for us to be with our emotions, to not try to solve problems through our logos brain. So yeah, my hope for all of us is to talk about this more, because the more we talk about it, the less scary it may be for you, but may also for your, you know, I talk about death with my 7 and 9-year-old kids all the time. Our dog died last year. They chose to be there for the whole process. When they tell their friends this, their friends look at them like, oh my God, I don't know what to do, because their parents haven't talked to them about death. And that's not a judgment. It's just a noticing that we have to talk about it more. So yeah, that's it's been lovely to have this conversation. As you said, yeah, and I have it all the time, and my virtual door is always open if anybody wants to pop into my office hours and talk more.
Thank you so much. So with that, I'll close the semi-formal part of this evening. I'll thank you both once again, Janice Selbie and Megan Sheldon, for taking the time to talk to me about this. Thank you so much to everyone who joined. I'll put the links that you've both given me in an email to everyone who RSVP'd. I'll put the links as well in the show notes on YouTube when I eventually post this. And with that, I'll say good night to the recording, and we'll have